The letter arrived on Tuesday morning, tucked between the household accounts and a note from the vicar, and for a moment, Lady Isabella Fairfax nearly set it aside without opening it at all.
The estate is
It bore
yours,
no
Isabella.
crest she recognised,
I
only a
understand.
plain wax seal and her
It
name
is warm.
written in the careful, unhurried hand of her
It is
late father's
impossibly
solicitor,
warm.
a man she had not heard from in nearly 3 years. She broke the seal at the breakfast table, expecting little more than some final, tedious matter of her father's long-settled estate. What she found instead made her set down her teacup with hands that were not quite steady. "My lady," the letter began, "I write to inform you that, in accordance with a clause in your father's original will, one which, I confess, escaped my attention until a recent review of the estate's records, the parcel of land known locally as Hollow Marsh has never, in fact, been formally transferred to the Duke's holdings, as your family has long believed. The land remains, and has always remained, legally yours." She did not know then that a single overlooked clause, buried in a will 6 years old, was about to unravel everything her family believed it understood about the worst piece of land in the entire county, and about the Duke who had given it to her 5 years before, believing he was handing her nothing at all. Before I take you back to that gift, and to the marsh no one else wanted, I want to ask something of you. If stories like this one, stories of quiet, underestimated women who turn a powerful man's contempt into something far greater than he ever imagined, are the kind of stories you enjoy, then please take a moment now to subscribe so you never miss the next one. And I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it always amazes me how far these old English stories reach. Now, let us return to the beginning, to the day a duke, wishing to be rid of an inconvenient ward, handed her a stretch of land he was certain would ruin her. 5 years before that letter arrived, Isabella Fairfax had been, by every account that mattered to Ashenbrook society, a young woman with very little left to lose. Her father, a modest but respected gentleman landowner, had died suddenly when she was 19, leaving her not to the care of any close relation, but to the distant guardianship of her father's second cousin, Duke Harland Vance, a man she had met perhaps twice in her life before his sudden, unwanted responsibility for her future began. Her father's small estate, mismanaged in its final years by illness and neglect, had been swiftly absorbed into the Duke's considerably larger holdings, leaving Isabella with little more than a modest allowance, a diminishing set of prospects, and a guardian who made no particular secret of finding her presence a burden. She was not unintelligent, quite the opposite, in fact, which the Duke found, if anything, more tiresome than a simple dullness might have been. She asked pointed questions about her father's estate accounts that the Duke's stewards found difficult to answer honestly. She read agricultural pamphlets that most ladies of her position would never have thought to open. She had, more than once, corrected a dinner guest's confident but mistaken assertion about drainage and soil quality, earning herself a reputation in the county as clever, which was, among Ashenbrook's more traditional families, rarely meant as a compliment. By the time she turned 22, the Duke had grown weary of a ward who showed no interest in the quiet, advantageous marriage he had half-heartedly attempted to arrange for her, and even wearier of the small but persistent voice in the county that whispered he had absorbed her father's estate rather too conveniently for a grieving girl's own good. She did not know then that his solution to both problems, her inconvenient presence and the whispers about her father's land, would arrive in the form of a single, dismissive gift. "You have asked for independence," the Duke said to her one grey October morning, in the same clipped, impatient tone he used for tenant disputes and tradesmen's bills. "Very well. I am prepared to grant it. There is a parcel of land at the edge of the estate, Hollow Marsh, the tenants call it, of no use to me, and, I dare say, of no use to anyone. You may have it, along with a small allowance and a cottage at its edge. Consider it your father's legacy, restored to you in whatever meagre form it can still take. Isabella had walked Hollow Marsh only once before, as a girl, on a dare from a cousin long since married and gone from the county. She remembered it as a low, waterlogged stretch of ground, thick with reeds and stagnant pools, prone to flooding every spring, useless for grazing and worse for farming. The tenants who had once attempted to work its edges had abandoned the effort within a season, and the land had sat, forgotten and unclaimed by any productive purpose, for as long as anyone in the village could recall. Give her the worst land, the Duke was reported to have said to his steward, not quite quietly enough to escape the notice of the servants who later, inevitably, repeated it throughout the household. It will keep her occupied, and it will cost this family nothing further to be rid of her complaints. She did not know then, standing in the Duke's study, accepting what he clearly believed to be a hollow, worthless gesture, that Hollow Marsh held something beneath its waterlogged surface that neither the Duke nor his father before him, nor any tenant who had ever tried and failed to farm it, had ever thought to look for. The cottage at the marsh's edge was, when Isabella first arrived to claim it, barely more hospitable than the land itself. It had stood empty for over a decade, its thatch rotted through in places, its small garden long since reclaimed by the same reeds and wild growth that dominated the marsh beyond it. The nearest neighbours were a full mile distant, and the village itself, another 2 miles past that, regarded her arrival with the particular mixture of pity and quiet scandal reserved for gentlewomen who had, in their estimation, fallen considerably further than their birth ought to have allowed. She did not know then that this isolation, so pitied by the county, would become the very condition under which she finally learned to see her situation clearly, without the constant noise of other people's expectations pressing in on every decision. The early months were, by any honest account, difficult. The cottage required more repair than her small allowance could easily cover. The marsh flooded twice in her first winter alone. Once badly enough that she was forced to wade, skirts soaked through and ruined, to retrieve what few possessions she had managed to save from the rising water. Old Mrs. Colby, who kept the modest shop in the nearest village, told her plainly, the first time Isabella came to purchase what supplies she could afford, that a lady oughtn't be living out there among the reeds alone, whatever the Duke's reasons for putting her there. But Isabella, unlike the county at large, had never quite stopped asking the questions that had once embarrassed dinner guests. And it was in continuing to ask them, patiently, methodically, without any particular hope of reward, that she began, slowly, to notice things about Hollow Marsh that no one else, in decades of dismissing it, had ever bothered to observe. It was old Thomas Rowe, one of the few tenants who still occasionally grazed a handful of geese along the marsh's drier edges, who first mentioned the spring. Peculiar water, that, he said one afternoon, nodding toward a particular pool near the marsh's eastern boundary, one Isabella had passed a dozen times without particular notice. My grandfather used to say it never froze, even in the hardest winters, and that the old folk hereabouts believed it had some manner of healing property, back before anyone thought to question such things properly. Superstition, most like, but peculiar water all the same. She did not know then that this single, offhand comment from an old tenant who grazed geese for a living was about to become the thread that unravelled everything the Fairfax and Vance families had assumed for generations about the worthlessness of Hollow Marsh. That evening, walking the boundary by lantern light, as she had taken to doing regularly in the months since her arrival, Isabella found the pool Rowe had described. She knelt at its edge, despite the cold, and touched the water with her bare hand, and found it, unmistakably, warmer than the frigid winter air around her, warmer than any ordinary spring water had any right to be in the depths of an English December. She did not know then precisely what caused it. She only knew, with the same careful, deliberate curiosity that had once made her the subject of the county's gossip, that a marsh dismissed as worthless by every man who had ever glanced at it did not behave like ordinary worthless ground. It took Isabella the better part of a year, and considerably more patience than the county believed a woman of her position capable of, to properly understand what she had found. She wrote first, cautiously and under a deliberately ambiguous signature, to a chemist in the county town, known for his interest in mineral waters, a growing fascination she had read in her father's old agricultural pamphlets among fashionable society, as more and more of the wealthy began travelling to towns like Bath and Harrogate to take the waters for their supposed healing properties. The chemist, a careful and unassuming man named Mr. Aldridge, arrived at Hollowmarsh expecting, he admitted candidly, very little of consequence. What he found instead, after several days spent testing the spring's mineral content, left him considerably more animated than his initial professional skepticism had suggested he was capable of. "This water is remarkably rich, my lady," he told her, standing at the pool's edge with his sample bottles carefully arranged before him. "Iron, sulfur, and several other properties I would need further study to fully identify, but properties very similar, I should say, to those found in the most fashionable spa towns, currently drawing society's attention and money in considerable quantities." Whoever dismissed this marsh as worthless clearly never thought to test what ran beneath it. She did not know then, standing in the cold beside a pool she had once walked past without a second glance, that Mr. Aldridge's careful assessment was about to set in motion 5 years of quiet, determined work that would transform Hollowmarsh from the county's most pitied piece of land into something considerably harder for the Duke to dismiss. It was in pursuing the deeper question of why such a spring had gone entirely unexamined for generations that Isabella uncovered the second, more troubling half of her discovery. She found it, in the end, not in any grand family archive, but in the modest, carefully kept records of the old village apothecary, a position long since discontinued, but whose records had been preserved out of simple habit by his granddaughter, who now ran the village's small shop in his stead. Buried among decades of routine notes on local remedies and treatments was a brief but pointed entry, dated some 40 years earlier, in the apothecary's own careful hand. Called again to Hollowmarsh at the request of the old Duke, it read, to examine the spring at the property's eastern edge, following renewed local talk of its healing properties. I confirmed, as I had some years prior, that the water shows genuine mineral richness worthy of further investigation, and recommended as much in writing to the estate. I have heard nothing further on the matter, and understand from the steward that His Grace considers the marsh a troublesome, low-value parcel not worth the estate's attention. She did not know then that this single dismissed recommendation, filed away and forgotten for 4 decades, was the true reason Hollowmarsh had remained, generation after generation, the worst land on the Vance estate, not because it truly was worthless, but because no duke since had ever cared enough to look twice at what a careful examination had already revealed. The current duke, she understood now with a growing and rather bitter clarity, had not given her worthless land at all. He had given her land his own family had deliberately neglected to properly value, not from ignorance, but from a long-standing unwillingness to be troubled by anything that required genuine attention rather than convenient dismissal. Before we continue into what Isabella built from this discovery, and how word of it slowly transformed the county's opinion of her, if you're finding yourself invested in her story, this is a wonderful moment to subscribe so you don't miss how it unfolds, or the many other stories like it I share regularly. And if you haven't already, I'd love it if you left a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. It's one of my favourite parts of sharing these stories. Now, back to Hollowmarsh and the 5 patient years that would change everything. Isabella did not rush to announce what she had found, understanding, with the same careful instinct that had guided every decision since her arrival at the marsh, that a woman alone, without powerful allies, who suddenly claimed her worthless land contained a valuable mineral spring, risked having that discovery quietly taken from her before she could ever properly secure it. Instead, she spent the better part of a year working quietly with Mr. Aldridge and, eventually, a small circle of investors he discreetly introduced her to. Men more interested in the genuine promise of a well-documented mineral spring than in the gossip surrounding the unusual woman who owned it. She used her modest remaining funds, supplemented carefully by early, cautious investment, to drain the worst of the marsh's flooding, to build a small, unassuming bathhouse at the spring's edge, and to begin, slowly and without fanfare, inviting a handful of discreet visitors to sample the waters that old Thomas Roe's grandfather had once dismissed as mere superstition. The first visitors came quietly, at Mr. Tom Aldridge's careful recommendation, a gentleman suffering from rheumatism who found genuine relief after a fortnight's stay, a lady recovering from a long illness who wrote afterward to her friends of the marsh's remarkable restorative waters. Word, as it always does among society eager for the next fashionable remedy, began to spread, slowly at first, and then, as the fashionable season approached, considerably less slowly. She did not know then how quickly the county's opinion of Hollow Marsh and of her would begin to shift, nor how uncomfortable that shift would prove for the very family that had once been so certain of its worthlessness. By the third year, what had once been a single small bathhouse beside a forgotten pool had grown into a modest but genuinely respected establishment, Hollow Springs, as it came to be known, drawing visitors not merely from the county, but from London itself, eager to sample waters increasingly spoken of, in the fashionable circles that mattered most, as rivaling those of the grander, more established spa towns. Isabella managed the growing enterprise with the same careful, methodical attention she had once applied to her father's abandoned agricultural pamphlets, insisting on fair wages for the small staff she employed, many of them drawn from the same village that had once pitied her arrival, and on a genuine, unhurried quality of care that distinguished Hollow Springs from more fashionable but less scrupulous establishments springing up elsewhere to capture the same growing demand. Old Mrs. Colby, who had once warned her plainly against living alone among the reeds, became, in time, one of her most devoted supporters, telling anyone who would listen in the village shop that Lady Fairfax built something real out of that marsh, while half the gentry in this county wouldn't have bothered to try. She did not know, in those first uncertain years of building something from ground everyone else had abandoned, that Hollow Springs would eventually become not merely successful, but genuinely, unmistakably more valuable, in income, in reputation, and in the quiet respect it slowly earned her, than the very estate the Duke had spent his life so carefully and so complacently maintaining. It was in the 5th year, precisely as her solicitor's letter arrived that Tuesday morning, that the final and most significant piece of Isabella's story came fully into the light. The clause the solicitor had uncovered, buried in her father's original will, had never been a matter of any real controversy at the time it was written, simply a standard provision, common enough in such documents, specifying that any land held by the Fairfax family at the time of her father's death, including Hollow Marsh, would pass directly and irrevocably to Isabella upon her 21st birthday, regardless of any guardianship arrangement made in the interim. The Duke, in his haste 5 years earlier to be rid of an inconvenient ward and a troublesome piece of land in a single dismissive gesture, had never actually needed to grant her Hollow Marsh at all. It had, in the strictest legal sense, already been hers, a fact his own stewards, in their haste to finalize the absorption of her father's estate, had simply overlooked amid the general disorder following her father's sudden death. She did not know, reading that letter over a now cold cup of tea, whether to laugh or weep at the discovery that the Duke's careless, dismissive gift had in truth never been his to give at all, that everything he believed he had generously discarded had in fact belonged to her all along, waiting only for someone patient enough to look closely enough to find it. The Duke came to Hollow Springs himself, some weeks after the solicitor's letter, having heard, as the whole county now had, of the establishment's growing fame, and, more pointedly, of the legal discovery that had rendered his original gift something considerably more complicated than he had ever intended. He found Isabella in the small office she had built for herself, overlooking the now thriving grounds, no longer the uncertain young woman he had so carelessly dismissed 5 years before, but a woman whose quiet, steady composure made even a duke visibly uncertain of his footing. "I understand," he said, with considerably less confidence than he had once commanded, "that there has been some irregularity regarding the original transfer of this land." "There has been a correction, Your Grace," Isabella replied evenly, "to an oversight that, I confess, worked rather in my favour in the end. Though I do wonder whether you would have looked more closely at Hollowmarsh's true value, all those years ago, had you known it was never truly yours to give away so carelessly in the first place." He did not answer that directly, and she did not press him to. She understood by then that she owed him neither an explanation nor an accounting of what she had built, only, perhaps, a measure of the same quiet dignity she had always tried to extend, even to those who had never extended it to her. "I had hoped," the Duke said finally, with what she recognized, somewhat to her surprise, as genuine and considerable discomfort, "that we might discuss some manner of arrangement given the changed circumstances." "We may discuss whatever you like, Your Grace," Isabella said, "but I think you will find I negotiate rather differently now than the ward you once thought you were finally rid of." The years that followed cemented what the county had, by then, already quietly come to understand, that Hollow Springs, built from the very land the Duke had once discarded as worthless, had grown into an enterprise whose value, in both income and reputation, considerably exceeded what remained of the Duke's own increasingly strained holdings that had suffered, over the same 5 years, from the same complacent, inattentive management that had once caused him to dismiss a mineral spring without ever thinking to test its waters. Isabella did not seek to humiliate him, though she certainly could have, nor to press her legal advantage further than fairness required. She agreed, in the end, to a modest and genuinely equitable arrangement regarding the shared access roads between their properties, negotiated, this time, not as a dismissed ward accepting whatever scraps a guardian offered, but as an independent woman of considerable standing, dealing with an equal. The county, which had once pitied her arrival at a waterlogged, forgotten cottage, now spoke of Lady Isabella Fairfax with a respect that had taken 5 patient years to earn, and would, she suspected, take considerably longer for some of its more traditional members to fully accept. But she found, in the end, that she required rather less of their approval than she once might have imagined. She kept the small original bathhouse exactly as it had first been built, even as Hollow Springs grew into something considerably grander around it, not as a monument to the Duke's carelessness, but as a quiet reminder to herself of the cold winter evening she had first knelt at the edge of an unremarkable pool and refused to accept that its warmth meant nothing. Years later, when a young cousin, newly arrived in reduced circumstances of her own, asked how she had built something so remarkable from land everyone else had called worthless, Isabella would only smile and tell her that she had simply refused to believe that a thing dismissed by careless men was therefore without value, that sometimes the very ground everyone else walked past without looking was waiting only for someone patient enough to kneel down and look properly. She had not known, that grey October morning, when the Duke handed her the worst land in the county with barely a glance in her direction, that she was being given not a punishment, but a beginning. But she had accepted it all the same. If this story moved you, please please consider subscribing for more forgotten tales of English aristocracy, hidden legacies, and the quiet women history so often underestimated. And don't forget, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. Thank you for staying until the very end.